As I'm following the way this war is developing, I thought I'd write up an essay and put together some of my thoughts on what's been happening and why it's been happening and what these things could mean. Trying to keep up with the pace of what is happening in the war is very challenging, of course. And so there's several things that I want to address in this essay, in what I'm going to be writing. So the basic outline is this. In the first part, I'll address the justification of the war from a moral point of view, from a geopolitical point of view, and from an inevitability point of view. And I want to go through these arguments in a way that presents a clear picture. Then I want to go through the counter-arguments. These will be the arguments that are specifically countering the pro-war arguments. I want to examine these to see if they have merit. Then finally, I want to examine other arguments against the war that are not specific counter-arguments and see what value they hold. And the second part, I want to address the logistics and supply issues that determine whether it will be possible for the United States to obtain its objectives in this war. And in addition, I want to examine the economic, political, and security effects that could ensue as a result of how the war plays itself out. So this, right now, will just be an overview of the moral justification of the war. Okay, the moral justification for the war. Now, before I begin, I want to preface this with the following. None of what you are about to hear has any meaning if the USA and Israel cannot both fully win this war against Iran and also put Russia and China at a significant strategic disadvantage in the process. That's very important. None of this will have any meaning if those objectives cannot happen. And so I want to keep that in mind as we go through this. Okay, so let's look at the nation of Iran in the big picture. From what I've read, the leadership of Iran is entirely from the Twelver Shia tradition of Islam. Article 12 of the Iranian Constitution states, the official religion of Iran is Islam and the Twelver Jafari school, and this principle will remain eternally immutable. That's a quote. Twelver theology holds that the 12th Imam, also known as the Islamic Mahdi or the hidden Imam, is currently in occultation. I don't really know what they mean by that word. It's some kind of like hidden condition. Because he's in occultation, he will emerge to rule Islam and the rest of the world in the end times. And this belief system is embedded in the minds of the leaders of Iran. There are several reasons this religious system manifests as an anti-American and anti-Israeli mission, which is kind of the core idea of their political legitimacy. And the reasons are, first, the Twelver belief system holds that there is only one legitimate ruler of the Islamic community, the Mahdi, or the 12th Imam who disappeared in 874 AD. Therefore, while awaiting his return, no human being could legitimately rule the Islamic community, and so the Shia scholars in Najaf, Iraq, taught that Islamic clerics should guide society but should not rule the state. This became known as the Quietist tradition in Shia theology, which became a predominant theological position for Shia Muslims for hundreds of years. Now we have to just mention here that Shia Islam is only somewhere like 15 to 20% of all Islam. Most Islam is Sunni, and they don't hold to the Mahdi coming and ruling the world. Well, some of them do, but they don't have that idea that it has to be him. But the Shia do, and that's and within Shia, there's this division between the Quietist tradition, which is what I just mentioned, and the newer position, which is where the Iranian regime falls. So with the Iranian Revolution in 1979, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, not the same guy as the guy that was just killed in the war, Khomeini died in 1989, but he led the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and he developed the revolutionary tradition of Shia Islam. And this holds to four core principles. One is the hidden Imam is the only rightful ruler. Two, He is currently absent during his time of occultation. 3, Islamic scholars under this school of theology are the only ones who understand the hidden imam's divine law. And 4, a leading Islamic jurist should wield political authority until the return of the hidden imam, because he's absent. And that fourth principle is where is what gives them their religious and moral authority to govern Iran, is that it is an Islamic jurist. So essentially this means that because the hidden imam is temporarily absent, Islamic jurists must rule in his place. But not just any Islamic jurists, they must be from the Twelver belief system of Shia. And they must be from Khomeini's revolutionary school. They can't be of the quietist tradition. They have to be Khomeini's revolutionary tradition, because they are the only ones who truly understand God's law. This is the doctrine of the guardianship of the jurist, or in their language, the wilayat al-faqih. Among Shia Muslims, scholars have estimated that around 90% of Shia are Twelvers, and of the Twelvers, only 15% of all the Shia Muslims hold to Ayatollah Khomeini's school of revolutionary ideology, which is based out of the city of Qom. The rest of the Shia are quietists, and they do not believe that clerics should rule the land. So what this means is that under the belief system of the rulers of Iran, the clerical rulers of Iran are on a divine mission. Their divine mission is to protect the Islamic world while waiting for the return of the Mahdi. The supreme leader of Iran is therefore a deputy to the Mahdi, who is the hidden imam, appointed by Allah to rule the earth. Their mission, therefore, is uncompromising, even to the point of death. This is the worldview and the mindset that they have. Now, to take this further, the Twelvers look at Western powers as forces of injustice and domination. Historically, the Western powers held spheres of influence in Iran for roughly a century. This influence grew in proportion to the building up of the Iranian oil industry in the 20th century. Foreigners ended up having a significant amount of influence over the direction of the country and on the policies of the Shah, who was established, it was in the early 1950s under a coup, implemented by the British MI6 and the CIA, if I remember my history right there. So they had this significant amount of influence on the policies of the Shah, and that contributed to the negative view that the people of Iran had of the Shah. Technically, Iran had never been an actual colony of any foreign nation, but much of the Iranian intelligentsia felt that Iran was de facto colonized by Russia wielding influence over the northern part of the country and Britain wielding influence over the southern part of the country. This intelligentsia ended up siding with Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamic Revolution in 1979 to overthrow the Shah, even though not all of them were in agreement with the principles of Khomeini's version of Shia Islam. As the Twelvers came into power after the 1979 revolution, Western powers were viewed as forces of injustice, domination, corruption, and resistance to Allah's rule through Islam. Therefore, the Twelvers saw themselves as divinely appointed guardians for establishing Allah's rule on earth. The primary avenue of resistance to this came from Western powers. To this establishing of Allah's rule on earth came from Western powers, in their view. And the Western powers were associated with foreign commercial interests. So while Western business leaders were focused on their business interests, the Twelver clerics and their growing number of followers in Iran increasingly saw those business interests as being antithetical to Islam. And of course, they believe that they are the true version of Islam. So with the formation of the nation state of Israel, aligned with the West, it came to be viewed as an extension of Western unbelief. It was a Western intrusion and occupation of Muslim land, which prevents unification of Muslims worldwide. And of course, a fundamental understanding within the Twelver school of theology is that their view is the only right view. Eventual unification of the world under Islam will begin with the unification of the Islamic world. And Israel stands in the way, and the West stands in the way. That's where they're coming from. So if you understand the uncompromising religious belief of the Twelvers, it explains why the Twelvers, who rule Iran, are so brutal to anyone resisting their rule, and why they believe it would be right for them to obtain a nuclear weapon and use it against the forces that resist the rule of Allah. They are a single, tightly bound religious community ruling over a wider religious community. Okay, so thinking about the effects of this, of just this rule, the rule of clerics, the rule of the clerics of Iran ruling over that entire country and having a significant outsized influence over the rest of the Islamic world because of their power is highly problematic. It's because there's only 15% of Shia Muslims believe that's the right interpretation of Shia Islam, and only 20% of all Muslims even are Shia. So it's a very small majority, but they have all this power, and they've gotten all these weapons, and they've done all these things. So it's very, very problematic. And I thought of what would be an analogy in the Christian world. So imagine if there were some Christian sect. Like, let's take, for example, in the 19th century, there was in the mid-20th century, there was a white supremacist Christian identity movement called the Christian Identity Movement. And they literally, not just tongue-in-cheek, they actually really believed that only white people were the true representatives of Christianity. And just imagine that they had gained significant power and wealth by striking oil or something like that. And then they took over the political leadership of a large area of the United States. Like, for example, imagine that they carved out their own semi-autonomous state in the Pacific North region around Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Utah, which is the area where they kind of dominated in the early to mid-20th century. So then imagine what if they grew so powerful that their white supremacist theology began to permeate other Christian traditions throughout the English-speaking world, and then, by extension, throughout the other languages in which Christianity had spread. Then imagine that they somehow became a sovereign nation, that they carved out that area and somehow separated from the United States. And while they were doing that, when they became a sovereign nation, they made public pronouncements claiming that it was their divine mission to dominate the entire globe with their version of Christianity and to use military power to extend it. And it would be right to use their military and political power to forcefully impose their version of Christianity on people all over the entire world. It just as a thought experiment. And then imagine, as a thought experiment, that this group was seeking to develop and obtain nuclear weapons. In that scenario, well, it's actually not too far different from what Nazi Germany did in World War II. Hitler, he suppressed a lot of Christianity within his own country, a lot of true biblical Christianity. Dietrich Bonhoeffer leading the confessing church is, of course, one of the principal examples of that. But he publicly adhered to a version of Christianity, even while they mixed it with a type of ancient German paganism. And they were seeking to politically dominate by means of military conquest. And they were seeking to develop nuclear weapons. Fortunately, they didn't get them. At the end of World War II, you think about the way Nazi ideology affected people's minds in Germany, the ones that were true and diehard Nazis. So the Allies went through and had a denazification campaign all throughout Germany by the Allies in which to basically prevent this ideology from rising up again. And during the denazification campaign by the Allies, there were many reports of defeated Nazis who never gave up their beliefs. They recognized they didn't have political power anymore, but they didn't give up their beliefs. And some of them moved to South American countries. Some of them slipped quietly into the shadows, and some of them sought to develop underground movements that would keep the Nazi dream alive in a dormant state until the day that the world would open up to them again. They held on to their belief in Nazi ideology with extreme religious zeal, and many of them went to their graves, still holding on to that belief. And so it serves as an example of what is necessary to erase that ideology, to turn it into just something that's part of history. To erase it is you have to completely politically take over that system and completely remove anyone that believes that from power. And that's a very difficult thing because we in the West and under our ideas of freedom, we don't want to tell people they're not allowed to believe certain things. But that's what they had to do in Nazi Germany. And if you think about the mindset of the 12 Shia clerics who rule of Iran, it's very similar in terms of how strongly it grips their belief system, the same as the Nazi ideology. And these people in Iran, the 12 Shia clerics, they've only grown in power and influence, while the Western world has been asleep, failing to recognize this growing danger. They also follow the Islamic principle of taqiyya. This idea wasn't invented by the Shia, but it became very predominant in the history of the Shia because they were persecuted by other Muslims. And the idea of shakiyya holds that, if you read about it, it gives a sanitized version on Wikipedia that it's legitimate for them to do what's necessary to hide their beliefs in order to protect them from persecution. But what it really works out to in practice is that it's morally justifiable to lie and use deception in order to further the cause of Islam and or protect Muslims from harm. And we understand that now because this became, in the war on terror, since 9/11, this became something that many people recognized was one of the problems in the worldview of Islam, the idea of taqiyya. And I even had someone I know who lived in a Muslim country for many years explain to me how there are a lot of Muslims that actually are kind of embarrassed about taqiyya, but they don't deny it. So in this idea of taqiyya, when Iranian spokespersons have said for years that their pursuit of nuclear technology is for peaceful purposes, every reasonable person in the world knows that they've been lying. Their intent has always been to develop nuclear weapons to use them. Since their stated enemies are Israel and the United States, as pronouncements against them form the foundation for clerics' political legitimacy, it is not hard to guess who the targets would be if they ever got their hands on a nuclear weapon. While Israel and the United States would be the primary targets if they got a nuclear weapon, it does beg the question, would they use a nuclear bomb on other Muslim nations? And while, of course, we cannot know for certain, it's plausible to imagine that they probably would, given that they have no qualms about massacring tens of thousands of their own citizens at a time, just like they did last month. And most of those citizens are Muslims, and that they've been willing to launch missiles against their Muslim neighbors in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and all these other places. It's reasonable to expect that they would not hesitate to use nuclear weapons against other Muslims as well. Now, if they did use nuclear weapons, when they use nuclear weapons against Israelis or Europeans or Americans, they would do so without remorse. And so the difference is when they would probably see using nuclear weapons against fellow Muslims as a sad but necessary endeavor. And that follows the pattern of when Muslims end up killing Muslims in their terrorist attacks against non-Muslims, they feel bad for the Muslims that they killed. They don't feel bad for the non-Muslims they killed. So the fact that Iranian 12ers might feel bad about killing fellow Muslims with nuclear weapons, it really would make no difference to the dead. And I think that's something we need to recognize is in their minds. It doesn't do any good for someone to just feel bad about something, but do commit the evil anyway. Now, George Friedman of Geopolitical Futures had a really good explanation of this the other day. He talked about the possibility of what he called a nuclear 9/11. The idea is that in the same way that there was a completely unexpected attack on September 11th, 2001 by Islamic terrorists flying planes into the World Trade Center towers, imagine if someone did something similar, except with nuclear missiles instead of airplanes. How could they carry that out? It's not hard to imagine. Using sophisticated intelligence networks with the help of the Chinese and or the Russians, they could put a nuclear bomb inside a container on a foreign flight container ship carrying goods for import into New York. The Port Newark Container Terminal is right across the mouth of the Hudson River from Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan. Once the ship is in the area, a containerized cruise missile with nukes could be armed and these cities could be attacked. Russia has already developed a type of containerized cruise missile. It's called the Club K. You can look that up. You can Google it. It's a system that looks like a standard shipping container, but when it arrives at its destination, it can be armed and primed to attack. So the technology is already there. Now, it would still be difficult. The feasibility of terrorists conducting an attack is still a bit far-fetched, but it's not impossible, and it's certainly reasonable to imagine that extremists might want to try and do something like this. Who would actually be willing to try and conduct such an attack? Well, knowing the character and history and pronouncements of the Islamic Republic of Iran and their willingness to sponsor terror activities all over the world, and their belief that it is their divine purpose to destroy American Israel, it is not hard to imagine that they might actually try and do something like this. Imagine Russia sells them the technology to build a containerized missile system, and China gives them the AI to smooth out the launch sequence and mitigate some of the human emotions that might get in the way of execution. And all of a sudden you have a very real system in place that could be extremely dangerous for the world. So this brings us to the first point of the moral justification for the war against Iran. Based on their own pronouncements that they will never give up their pursuit of nuclear weapons, their publicly verifiable belief system that their divine mission is the destruction of America and Israel, and their trade relationships with Russia and China to obtain materials and expertise for weapons manufacturing, they had to be stopped. At least that's what it seems is probably the reasoning behind the actions of the Trump administration's launching of the war against Iran, or a big part of it at least. And if you look at what's been uncovered so far in this war, it's been quite astounding. Iran has built up a massive arsenal and system of manufacturing of weapons. American and Israeli intel have found dozens of missile cities. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal last week about all that. Hidden underground, all these missile cities, hidden underground for producing all kinds of missiles and drones that were intended to be used against Israel, America, and any countries that were willing to work with them. Iranian weapons makers were the early suppliers of the Shahed drones, which Russia has used to devastate Ukraine. They have exported tons of missiles and drones to Hezbollah and the Houthis. So there's no indication that they were actually seeking any kind of peaceful activities. The Iranian economy is a huge mess, and the Iranian government has diverted all their resources to producing weapons. When their own people last month protested because they don't have any money to buy food because the country is doing everything they can just to develop weapons on their divine mission, how did the Iranian government respond? They massacred over 10,000 of them. Some reports are as high as up to 30,000 of them. People go to the government begging for food, and they shoot them, and they kill them. And all of this for the sake of a Shia divine mission to bring back the hidden imam and usher onto the world a full Islamic republic to rule and bind the entire world into submission. That's what the mindset of the Islamic clerics that rule Iran contains. That's the way they think. So then it begs another question. Would it have been wiser to wait until Iran made another attack, or to just try and contain them so that we could, or if we waited until they made another attack, then we could operate in a defensive posture and have the moral high ground? And that's a legitimate thing to ask. Well, you have to think about this. They've been very clever about the way they make attacks. For example, on October 7th, 2023, they attacked Israel through Hamas. And as I wrote about earlier, it wasn't just a normal attack. These were individual operatives from Hamas going into Israeli homes and murdering citizens, women and children, and all that kind of thing. It wasn't dropping bombs in a distant place or exploding a bomb in a crowd. It was going in and killing people with knives in their homes. And en masse, over 1,200 Israelis were killed. And so when that happened, of course, Israel responded. And from the very beginning, the entire world has repeatedly condemned Israel by saying that their response was disproportionate. Now, my point here is I'm not here to argue whether or not Israel's response was disproportionate. What I want to do here is I want to look and try and understand Israel's mindset in opposition to the world narrative that it's all Israel's fault, and then extend that to where the United States how the United States needs to look at this. So, in this event that happened, Iran attacked a major offensive, and yet the world began to condemn Israel. It didn't take long for the war to get going before the world started to condemn Israel. And it literally started just a few days after Israel was initially attacked. Israel was engaging Hamas in battle, and there was a Hamas rocket that went off course, and it hit a Palestinian hospital, killing dozens of Palestinians. Then Hamas released a statement saying that it was an Israeli rocket deliberately attacking a humanitarian target. The press immediately ran with that story, blaming Israel, even though it was a Hamas rocket. And from that point on, all of the mainstream media coverage had a condemning undertone towards the Israelis. And this sets the tone for how Israel responds now. And this is the point of where we need to understand. Israel feels like there's no point in trying to obtain the moral high ground in the eyes of the rest of the world because they're never going to get it, no matter what they do. Even when 1,200 of their citizens are massacred in cold blood, and they respond to try and erase the ideology out of the people that massacred them, the whole world is going to condemn them regardless. So to them, it's like, there's no point. Why try and get the moral high ground? We have to do what's necessary so that we survive. That's kind of where the Israelis are. So going back to Iran, who sponsored Hamas's actions in that, looking at the big picture in Iran, basically, as Joel Rosenberg has wrote several years ago, in Iran, basically, we have a genocidal death cult that represents a very small percentage of actual Muslims, but it's a genocidal death cult, and they have been ruling the nation of Iran since 1979, sponsoring terror throughout the region, expanding their network, murdering dissidents, drawing more people into becoming followers of their belief system, seeking to get nuclear weapons. And they've been supplied materially and materially supported by the West's two biggest adversaries, Russia and China. That's the situation. That's the condition of Iran and where it's been. So from a moral point of view, a war to eliminate this threat is something that's hard to oppose. It could only do the world some good. And of course, it seems like it's something that really needs to be done. The assumption there, of course, is that this is the right time to undertake such an endeavor. And so, again, I want to reiterate, everything that I just said, everything that I just spoke, none of this has any meaning if the United States and Israel cannot both fully win this war against Iran and also put Russia and China at a significant strategic disadvantage in the process. Otherwise, we're dealing with something that's far bigger than what the Trump administration has made it out to be. So, when we look at that, and in the subsequent talks, essays that I'm going to write, the moral justification alone, even though it's a very strong case, it's not enough to fully justify the war. We must also look at other justifications, like the geopolitical justification. And we must also look at the practical feasibility of the war. We should consider the second and third order derivative implications to see if the war really will be good for America and for Israel and good for the world. These are things that we need to discuss. These are things I'm going to be working to write about also as we go through this. So I hope that this was helpful, and I pray that as you pray and meditate and think about the things that are happening, that you will not be despairing of hope. God is still in control. He's still on the throne. He still loves us, and we can trust him. So I'll be back.